So the topic of this video is prejudice and discrimination. So prejudice refers to an unjustified, usually negative attitude toward an individual based solely on their membership in a particular social group. Prejudice includes three components: beliefs or stereotypes, emotions such as fear and hostility, and third, a behavioral tendency to discriminate. So it's important to remember that prejudice is not always loud or explicit. It can also be subtle, automatic, or unintentional. So in this lecture, we'll look at where prejudice comes from, why it persists, even when society has become more tolerant overall, and how our thoughts, emotions, and social environments work together to shape the way that we view both ourselves and others. So again, prejudice refers to an unjustified, usually negative attitude toward an individual based solely on their membership in a particular social group. So it includes beliefs or stereotypes, um, and it also includes emotions like fear and hostility, and a behavioral tendency to discriminate, right? So discrimination refers to unjustified behavior selectively applied to members of a group. And then a stereotype is just a generalized belief about a group applied to every member of that group. Interestingly, although many problems still exist, many common indicators of prejudice have improved with time. So, for example, there's public support for interracial marriage, there's equal pay for equal work. So, it used to be the case as late as the 1960s and 70s that we would have different pay scales for men and women, even though they were performing equal work, right? But that's no longer the case. So we have public support for interracial marriage, for equal pay for both genders, and also for LGBTQ plus rights in the last decades. Access to education has widened as well. But these improvements don't necessarily mean that prejudice in itself has disappeared. Often it becomes more subtle or shifts into new forms. So what used to be openly expressed might show up as hesitation, discomfort, or unequal treatment, even when people hold positive attitudes on the surface. So these mixed trends help us understand why studying prejudice remains important. Even though social attitudes can change, the underlying biases that once promoted this behavior often shift and change rather than vanishing completely. So how do social scientists and psychologists study prejudice? Well, the easiest way to measure prejudice is explicitly using various self-report measures. So explicit measures of prejudice ask people directly about their attitudes using questionnaires, rating scales, or surveys. So these capture conscious, deliberate beliefs, although they can be influenced by social desirability, right? And social desirability is just whenever you're filling out a survey that you include your personal information on. If you're asked about sensitive or controversial beliefs or behaviors, you tend to be dishonest if you think that admitting to those beliefs or behaviors could decrease your social desirability or the extent to which your peers respect you and want to associate with you, right? So that's why if we're asking people to self-report, like whether they've ever taken illicit drugs or whether they've cheated on a test, we would want to keep those surveys anonymous because we know that social desirability bias might prevent them from answering honestly. But a classic example of a study using an explicit or self-report measure of prejudice is the use of the modern racism scale. So the modern racism scale assesses subtle, socially acceptable forms of prejudice. So for example, whether people believe discrimination is still a problem. Another example is feeling thermometers, where participants rate their warmth or coldness toward different groups. So in the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, researchers used self-report attitude scales toward Black Americans and immigrants to track changes in public opinion, showing that explicit prejudice declined significantly over decades. Implicit measures of prejudice assess automatic or unconscious biases that people might not recognize or might not want to admit. So the most widely known example is the implicit association test, abbreviated IAT, which was developed by Greenwald, McGee, and Schwartz in 1998. So in the typical race implicit association test, participants quickly categorize words such as good and bad along with black and white faces. So faster associations between one race and negative words indicate an implicit bias. So implicit measures often reveal biases even among people who sincerely endorse egalitarian or anti-racist views, suggesting that some prejudice are learned culturally and operate automatically outside of the awareness of individuals. Behavioral measures of prejudice, as the name suggests, observe actual behavior toward members of different groups, often in naturalistic or only semi-controlled studies. So a classic example is the lost letter technique by Stanley Milgram and colleagues, where researchers accidentally dropped stamped addressed letters around a city. So letters that were addressed to socially accepted groups were returned more frequently than letters addressed to stigmatized groups, demonstrating behavioral discrimination. Another example is helping behavior studies. Such research has shown that people are slower to offer assistance, such as picking up dropped items, when the target belongs to an outgroup. So these measures capture how prejudice influences real actions, not just beliefs. Lastly, we have physiological or neurological measures of prejudice. So collectively, these approaches examine bodily and brain responses that reflect automatic or implicit emotional reactions. So for instance, studies using skin conductance or heart rate changes show that people sometimes have a stronger physiological arousal response when exposed to outgroup faces, even if they deny prejudice. Um, neuroscience neuroscience studies have shown that when you put people, one study demonstrated that if you put people into an fMRI scanner and look at their neural responses when they look at black faces, they tend to show stronger activation in the amygdala, which is an area of the brain that processes emotion and also threat detection. But they found that whether or not you experience that dramatic increase in amygdala activity depends on your implicit biases. So individuals that scored high on the implicit association test for race show much stronger amygdala activation as compared to individuals that scored low on the AIT for race. So what are the roots of prejudice? Well, we know prejudice doesn't just come out of nowhere. It tends to grow in environments where groups have unequal access to resources, power, or social standing. And when some groups systematically have more opportunities than others, people often begin justifying those inequalities, sometimes without even realizing it. So social inequality is when some groups have fewer resources and opportunities than others. And another major factor is in-group bias, the natural human tendency to favor the group we belong to, even when that group is totally arbitrary. So experiments show that people will allocate more money, give more favorable judgments, and offer more trust to members of their own group, regardless of how meaningless the group assignment was. And a related idea is outgroup homogeneity, which is the belief that they're all the same, right? Which makes stereotypes easier to form and harder to break. So these social dynamics interact to create fertile ground for prejudice. So in addition to social roots of prejudice, emotion also plays a powerful role in prejudice, especially when people feel threatened, stressed, or frustrated. So scapegoat theory attempts to explain that when things go wrong, people often relieve their anger by blaming a vulnerable group. For example, during World War II, World War I and World War II, Germany experienced profound difficulty, economic difficulty. People were starving. The current German currency was losing its value, and they were struggling to recover some of the losses they had experienced during World War I. And so Adolf Hitler used Jewish individuals as a scapegoat. And he explained that all of Germany's ails, everything that was wrong with their country, was due to Jewish people. So research shows that temporary frustration increases prejudice, while supportive and loving environments tend to decrease it. Neuroscience findings link prejudice to fear responses in the amygdala, like I was talking about. So people with unusually low fear reactivity show less automatic prejudice, suggesting that emotional arousal contributes to prejudiced reactions or biased reactions. And these emotional roots help explain why prejudice can persist even when someone knows better intellectually. It often comes from gut level feelings rather than careful reasoning. In addition to social roots of prejudice, there are also cognitive roots of prejudice. So our brains rely on mental shortcuts known as heuristics to simplify a complicated social world, but these shortcuts sometimes create or reinforce stereotypes. So for example, the availability heuristic makes us remember vivid or extreme cases more easily, and those examples can shape our beliefs about entire groups, even when they aren't representative. Another cognitive factor is the belief in a just world. the comforting but inaccurate idea that people get what they deserve. So when someone holds this belief strongly, they may assume that social inequalities reflect effort or character or other dispositional qualities rather than discrimination. So these thought patterns make stereotypes feel logical or justified even when they're based on faulty reasoning, right? So a heuristic is a mental shortcut that by definition limits the amount of information that you're considering. And the availability heuristic is the fact that we have a memory bias such that we remember vivid cases or those we've thought about before more, and we deem them to be more likely than less vivid cases. And then belief in a just world is just that the that good people are rewarded and bad people are punished, so inequalities must exist for a reason. So our cognitive biases don't just create stereotypes, they also help maintain them. The availability heuristic leads us to build our impressions around dramatic, memorable examples rather than statistical reality about members of an outgroup. Confirmation bias keeps us focused on evidence that matches our existing beliefs, so we overlook counterexamples that could weaken our stereotypes. Hindsight bias leads to victim blaming, with people assuming that someone should have known better after the fact. And cognitive dissonance can reinforce prejudice when people see their cultural or family beliefs conflicting with ideals of fairness. Instead of questioning prejudice norms, they may rationalize them in order to reduce discomfort. So all of these thinking habits make prejudice feel more stable and self-justifying, even when it's based on distortions or completely false information.